Hello and welcome to the Proptech Hot Seat on iPropertyRadio with myself, Katie Tallon, the show where we explore trends and technologies driving innovation across the built environment. This show is brought to you in partnership with Proptech Ireland, the hub for innovators, investors, and indeed for industry leaders. Now, regular listeners will be familiar with our usual content that focuses on the technology that's helping the built environment drive towards net zero. And while we appreciate all of those technologies, innovation and how we do things and taking a fresh approach that sometimes isn't technology driven at all can be exceptionally important. And for that reason, I'm delighted to be joined by brothers Richard Mulcahy and David Mulcahy, co-founders of the 100 Million Trees Project. Gentlemen, you're both very welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Carol, for having us on.
Carol.
Now, and I should say that Richard and David are joining us. Richard, you're joining us kind of from the Wexford Wicklow border, and I know yes. David, you're on the North Kerry, Limerick, kind of Askeaton direction there. So I'm delighted that we're going to be talking about what you're doing on the ground and while you're still physically on the ground. And I know, Richard, you were in the west of Ireland last week. So we are definitely here to talk about kind of a nationwide project. So, Richard, you might just explain to us 100 million trees. What is the project about?
Exactly as it states, Carol. It's I've been in business all my life, and the one thing I've found is the simpler the message, the more effective you can be, and that's exactly what it is. Our plan is to plant 100 million native Irish trees over the next 10 years.
Excellent. And where are you with that project? What stage are you at the moment?
So we knew that it was slightly ambitious, and our psychiatrist said, yes, you are certainly taking on something here. So last year we decided we would first of all test, like any concept, you have to test it out, see what the issues are. So we set ourselves a target to plant 20,000 native trees in as many sites as possible to get a feel for what the issues were. And so we started off with the great support of Wexford County Council. They gave us a couple of sites, and we went out, we got volunteers, we talked to the tree companies, and we went out and we planted a number of trees. And the most important thing is we videoed all of them and photographed them to get an understanding of what the issues were. And then from that, we then honed our approach to this year. So this year, our target was to plant 200,000 trees. And from our learnings from last year, we didn't use as much volunteers because we realized to get the trees into the ground, we need professionals. So we signed up with Forestry Services, who are the biggest forestry company in the country, and they planted the trees for us. And we honed our sourcing of trees to two companies, Non So Hardy, which is an Irish company, and they grow their own trees, and Anavay, which are a big nursery as well, who could provide trees that couldn't be grown here. It's one of the things we learned, actually, that we're not growing very many trees in Ireland ourselves, for planting. So we, having developed those, then we set out to target to get 100 sites this year, and we're going to hit our 200. We planted even though it's been raining for the last 5 months, and we built our Noah's Ark to move the trees around out to the sites because it's been so wet. But we planted our 100,000 tree yesterday, and we will have 201,000 trees planted by the middle of April. Native trees.
That's amazing. That was a huge milestone to hit. So that's 100,000 trees now in the ground. So that's making a nice chunk into your 100 million ambition.
That's really, it's only, again, Carol, it's only a learning process, because to step it up, we planted 20,000 last year, we planted 100,000 this year so far, and we plant 200,000. And next year, our target is 1 million trees. So we're doing in steps to learn as we get bigger, what are the issues? Because the issues are always different when you're dealing with different volumes and questions. So,
of course, and I Okay, I have so many questions coming from a farming background. The conversations around land use, I am sure that there would not be universal support, but coming from the real estate and construction industry, where all of our drive is towards net zero, and it almost doesn't make sense the way we're doing it, as in creating things that will be low carbon without actually properly using the resources that we have. And maybe protecting what we have and looking at what used to work. So I want to explore all of that. But before we get into that, where did the idea come from? Where did the belief that this could happen and should happen come from?
Well, it came, first of all, we were brought up by a father who was always interested in trees, and back in the 70s, he went and he bought some land in Blessington, and he thought it'd be a good idea to dump us down there for the summer and plant trees in a little mobile home. And while he was a cardiologist, he went off and did his work. But he had this interest in trees, and he used to make us plant trees, and we weren't obviously very into that as kids and teenagers. But that love of trees developed, and the idea came from David. Started off with a project called Bugs, Bees, and Native Trees. And David, maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, well, so I set up a little group, Bugs, Bees, and Native Trees, to plant trees around the country in schools and institutions. Literally signed the kind of contracts the week before COVID hit. But we did a fair amount of work during the pandemic, and there was a lot of enthusiasm. We were planting fully, proper 7, 8 foot trees. And then Richard quite rightly spotted this Miyawaki method, where you can intensively plant small areas. And we kind of shifted over to that once we got some funding. Richard organized some fantastic funding from Uniphar, who are actually funding everything for us this year. And last year, our trial planting season was funded by Des Walsh, who's a friend of ours, lives in America. So he was conscious of the amount of flying he was doing and was keen to give back to the environment. But I think the attraction of the 100 Million Tree Project is the way we do things. So what you do is you plant mini forests. So you take sites of 1/4 of an acre. That keeps you below the regulatory line where you have to start getting permission or dealing with the different regulatory authorities. And in that 1/4 of an acre, you plant 2,500 native trees of 15 different types. Now, it seems to be evidence that trees of different types, native trees grown together, look after each other. And because they're grown so intensively, they grow very tall and very fast. So while some people will be interested ultimately in the carbon capture significance of it, in a way, I was kind of more concerned about the whole biodiversity thing, the loss of bees, the loss of birds, the loss of insects. And I always kind of say to people, when was the last time you got out of your car to clean insects off the windows, windscreen? It just doesn't happen anymore. There aren't any anymore. So if you plant 100,000 mini forests, it gives 100,000 areas of biodiversity. Because they're intensively planted, humans can't get into them, which is humans are probably the biggest danger to forests. Because there are lots of mini forests, forest fires, which for instance devastated Canada during the summer, aren't an issue because we're planting 100,000 or more mini forests, so we don't have to worry about forest fires. And from the building perspective, in terms of, say, the builders who are building these estates, one of the huge attractions is that instead of just having trees dotted around and lots of short green grass, often which is never used, you're introducing areas of biodiversity which, very importantly for the mental health of the people around, offer everything from bird song to different colours to all the different blossoms and buds that you get on all the Irish cherries and rowans and all the other beautiful Irish native trees. And it can all be done in 1/4 of an acre. So there's
one of the interesting things, sorry, Cara, just on David talking there, what they've discovered in Holland, they've done a couple of tests on this, and they've discovered also by planting mini forests that the trees don't get damaged the same way they do in a traditional estate or a park. And again, from a builder's point of view, when they're planting, estates, planting single trees, they tend to often get broken, and they put, it costs a lot of money for the builders to put in mature trees. So this is another benefit for builders in putting mini forests, because people can't get into them.
Yeah, and actually, I wanted just to clarify that figure to make sure that I understood it right. When you're talking about these mini forests, you're talking about an area as small as 1/4 of an acre, and you can plant 2,500 trees, 15 different species.
Yeah. So if you were planting a 1/4 of an acre, say according to quilter planning for say Sitka forests, you'd be planting just over 1,000 trees in an acre. So what we do is we plant 10,000 trees in an acre, and because they're so tied together, they grow like mad to chase the light. So you'll have a kind of Richard will be able to tell you more about the kind of carbon trapping, which is usually, I think, measured after about 5 to 7 years. But in terms of the biodiversity effect, it's fantastic, because humans can't get in, because they're native tree. Only one of them is a conifer, which is a Scots pine, which means that they have a proper undergrowth. I don't know if you've ever been into a Sitka forest, but the inside of a Sitka forest is just dead. Nothing grows on the ground. There's no ground surface for anything to survive. So with these mini forests, of course, they have 14 different types of deciduous trees. So there'll be a perfect ground cover. And so the benefit would be to the birds, the bees, the small animals, and that in terms of the mental health of the people who live near them, but also in terms of temperature control, in terms of, just
water retention.
Water retention, bird song, just the general health that trees bring, both to the mental and physical health of people. Cleaner air, improved, air quality, hopefully less respiratory diseases. So there are a whole series of benefits, and of course, from the carbon trapping point of view, Richard, you'd probably be able to comment more on that.
So if you take 2.5.
Sorry, Richard. No, you're fine. Just before we move on to the carbon trapping, just because I'm conscious that we do speak to a construction and development audience. I had been approaching this thinking this was maybe something that was going to be happening in the rural area, but because the space you need is so small, could you see this happening in housing estates in large urban areas?
Absolutely. It's the whole idea of this is planting trees is through urban and the countryside. And so we're doing a planting now in Dean's Grange with John Leary Rathdown County Council on the 16th of March, and that's in a park, Culkeen Park in Dean's Grange, and we're planting 2,000 trees in a 0.2 of an acre. So any estate around Dublin, or we've done a number of churches where they have grass leading up to the church itself. We've done 2 churches in Wexford where we planted 2,000 trees, and in tiny spaces. So it's a huge benefit for an urban environment as well as a country.
And so I suppose, and I do absolutely want to talk about the carbon capture side of it, but just in terms of the sites and the logistics, are these sites being transferred to you, or do you have a right to plant? Like, what's the ownership model here in terms of where does the ownership of the site stay with the original owner?
Absolutely. We've set this up to be as simple as possible, Carol. So one, we don't handle any money at all. We don't get involved in that side of things. A sponsor pays directly for the trees and the planters and any other work that has to be done. So the money goes directly from the company to the site. The site owners can be individuals, they can be county councils, they can be the GAA. We've done lots of different sites, and they own the site. We literally donate the trees and plant them for them. It's their property. We're relying on them that they want to put these trees in and leave them permanently for prosperity.
And is there a maintenance involved, a skilled maintenance that would need to be considered on an ongoing basis?
Absolutely not. The beauty about this is that after year 2, there's no stopping the trees. The trees are growing away. So the first 2 years is very simple. You just literally walk around the trees to walk the weeds down in the ground, and that's it. But the trees grow so quickly that they're above the weeds after year 2, way above the weeds after year 2. So there's no maintenance. In public areas, we tend to recommend to put a small fence in just for the first 2 years. After year 2, you can't get into it anyway, so it doesn't matter.
I can see that this would really be something that would be attractive in a placemaking context for anybody, urban or in more rural settings. So any developers who are putting together schemes, because a lot of the green areas traditionally were very sterile, lots, and that's not something that people appreciate now. So we are moving a little bit more towards embracing biodiversity, but that can be difficult to manage and maintain. What you're describing there seems like an ideal solution. So I want to just ask the question to get it out of the way, because I think it'll be what people listening might be interested in. You had mentioned there that your friend Des Walsh had sponsored some of the early planting to offset maybe some of the carbon attached to his travel, which is absolutely laudable. And then I think, was it Uniphar you mentioned had sponsored the planting this year?
So Uniphar have committed to sponsoring the planting of 200,000 native trees this year.
Amazing. Can you give people an idea of the cost involved, so they know what to expect?
So the cost of that is about 300,000 euro. So as you can see, we are doing it at a very, we're pinning it to the costs right down, because this isn't going to happen, Carol. If there are organizations out there who plant a tree for you for a family member or for somebody who's a celebration, and they charge 20 euros a tree to do that. We don't have time for stuff like that. We're out there. We're getting the best price from the forestry services people and the best price from the nurseries. We don't charge a penny for anything this. We want to do it because we really want to make a difference. So it's very cheap, really, when you think about it. 200,000 native trees in the ground, 300,000 euro.
Well, let's talk about the quarter of an acre example. So a developer who is planning their place at the moment, planning the green areas and the amenities, cognizant of retaining biodiversity. And I think David in particular was very compelling when you talk about birdsong and colour and all of those benefits to the people who would be there. But so just, would you consider taking on a project, say if a developer has a quarter of an acre, wants to plant 2,500 trees? Is that too small a project for you to get started on?
No, that's that is exactly what we need to do. You made a very good point about how sterile an awful lot of the kind of green spaces are, and funnily enough, it always reminds me of gardens. How little people actually use gardens. They look at them all right, but the estates are full of these kind of flat grass. Number one, it has to be cut with diesel mowers, and it has to be cut regularly. And of course, a lot of people cut it every 5 or 7 days, which is ridiculous, because you don't even get a chance for the native bee to use the grass to live in. But so you have a completely sterile area, as Richard says, with occasional trees, which are very beautiful and everything, but all much more likely to be damaged as well. So if you take a quarter of an acre, as Richard said, once the trees enter the land owned by the person who wants the trees, then they become theirs. Their public liability looks after their trees are theirs. It's taken on good faith that they want to do it for the same reasons as we do, to try and improve biodiversity and improve our kind of battle against climate change. So once we do that, then they're their trees. If we can organize, say, for a company that wanted to do multiple mini forests, then we could organize that they may wish to pay for them themselves. They may wish to pay rather than some outside sponsor. They might prefer to be seen to be sponsoring the trees themselves. But so we'd come in. If the trees were very near the houses, then we'd choose carefully in terms of we'd be using our Irish cherries, two Irish cherries, our rowans, our hawthorns, our birch. So you get lots of different colours and you get lots of little blossom. And then more on the peripheries of the site, you can put in your more beautiful, bigger trees like your oak and your Scots pine, which in 100 years, of course, will have achieved some height. So so there's a choice of 15, 16, 17 that we usually use. Mix them together, you should get a beautiful array of color throughout the year. And again, it's kind of impenetrable. And it's managed. You get a cup of tea twice a year, about 5 or 10 people. They walk through the forest over 15 minutes, and they trample down the weeds. Do that twice a year for a couple of years, and then the trees will look after themselves.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, Carol, just to answer your question in relation to the developers. We would be we would typically expect the developer just to prepare the ground for us, which they'd have diggers on site, and literally to turn the ground so that the soil is reasonable. In other countries, when you're planting the Miyawaki approach, you have to do all sorts of things. You have to add fertilizers, and you have to put bark to control the weeds and all of this sort of thing. And also a big problem in a lot of countries is watering. It's one of the things we don't have to worry about here in Ireland. So the developers have to do very little. They just just to turn the ground. Let's make sure there's about 6 inches of clay, and that's all they need to do. And we will come in, we will supply the trees and plant the trees for them, and we would charge €5,000 for such a planting for 2,500 trees. So it's nothing for development, and yet it has huge benefits for the community.
And not only that, but actually that's lower than the cost of the yearly maintenance of what's there at the moment.
Absolutely.
So cost-wise, so I could see how that would be attractive, but the overall offering, you've mentioned this approach a couple of times. Is it Miyawaki? I've never heard of it. Can you
Miyawaki.
explain?
So it was a professor, Akira Miyawaki in Japan, came up with this concept in the 70s. He discovered there are a lot of poor lands in Asia where they couldn't grow trees properly. And he discovered by planting trees very close together, they had to be native trees, that the stronger trees protect the weaker trees. So there was very little failure rate of trees, and the enzymes from the stronger trees were passed to the weaker trees. So they looked after each other. Unfortunately, unlike the way we live in our world, where we don't really look after each other, so we should learn from the trees on this. And he discovered by planting these trees, it improved the soil, it retained water, it created huge areas of biodiversity, and it got rapid growth of trees compared to traditional planting forests.
And also, of course, that because the places he was looking to plant, like Tokyo and various other places, obviously Tokyo's a wealthy place, but that there was very little free space to plant trees. So his idea was that he was intensively planting the little spaces there were, which allowed this rapid growth and this kind of mini forest concept to occur within urban areas, which of course obviously has its everything from temperature cooling to protection from the sun and clearer air. So a lot of benefits for small spaces to be used as areas of biodiversity.
You know, I'm always in the habit of trying to think of what the points of resistance would be. But as we go through it, I can see the small spaces, the huge boost to biodiversity locally. I can absolutely see the positive health and mental health benefits. And Richard, I particularly like the analogy of actually these mini forests thriving like a community, because I think you're absolutely right. Maybe there's something at a community level we can learn from this, and it would be lovely to see communities embrace. When you talk about doing this in the entrance of a couple of churches, I would see that being such an ideal site, as it would be for schools and for everything. So actually, in terms of points of resistance, when you think about the low cost, the fact that people aren't signing over their land, they're essentially the main points of resistance that people would normally have. I can see how this would be massively attractive for the industry that are looking to get involved and support initiatives like this at the moment. Are there a few things? So I've mentioned, David, you're in the car at the moment down in Askeaton looking at sites. Richard, you were in the west of Ireland last week. How will people know if their sites are suitable for this?
Well, I'm down here I've got a map from my sister Tina of 6 places to see in a circle and then back to Dublin. So we'll look at a lot of these sites, but there are very good videos on the website showing how to prepare a site, what size site will take how many trees. So if you have the size of a basketball court, you can plant 1,000 trees, and 2 basketball courts, 2,000 trees, and a quarter of an acre, 2,500 trees, and all of that is below that point at which you have to seek approval, and that means getting involved with the department and maybe to a certain extent delays and red tape, which is understandable. So we try and stay away from all that. The farmers, for instance, who we're dealing quite a bit with, are dealing with the acres programs and various grant programs, which are different, and I hope we're working very much symbiotically with them rather than against them. So
David, I don't know if you want to be associating your project with the likes of acres and others, because actually I think that they maybe have a very different motivation, and they may in 5 years to 7 years time result in land sterilisation. So there's actually a lot of fear around the acre scheme, and I think actually, you know, your approach is probably the polar opposite to the forestry approach that Europe is taking.
I think what I meant was that the what we're doing wouldn't be seen to be. So, for instance, we did have one planting organized, and then the person who was going to do it was advised by a member of a department not to go with our plan in case it might jeopardize their future grant opportunities for investing in biodiversity. So what we're trying to do is to stay well clear of anything to do with regulation or government, and we're just simply saying, will you give us a quarter of an acre? We will give you the trees. We will plant the trees for you. Don't cut them down if you can. But of course, once we hand them over, they're not our trees anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think you've touched on something really important, and that is around whether doing this would interfere with payments under acres and other similar schemes. And it shouldn't, because the concept of acres is that you're there to encourage biodiversity. But you know, and again, I think this probably comes down to the Teagasc advisor that you're talking to, or the advice that's been given. But I think maybe for the purposes of what we're doing today, it's probably a good idea to separate those entirely, because I believe that acres is problematic for people in rural areas. So actually, if their pure motivation is around encouraging biodiversity, I can see the 100 million trees project as being maybe less onerous.
I think there's no doubt about that. And in fact, the first farmer who we made a video with, a man called Donald O'Keefe, and he planted 4,200 between 2 different sites on his large cereal farm. And he pointed out that he had been battling to try to get his head around what the entitlements were, and whether the land was of such and such a type. And so he was very glad, because he had big combine harvesters, couldn't get into the corners of his fields. And those corners are about a quarter of an acre. So he was delighted. We planted those trees, and one of them beside a badger set. They'll be beautiful in a couple of years' time. He may not have got any grant money, but he got 4,200 free trees and planted, and he's very happy with that. And there was no regulation. He prepared the ground. We came down the next week, planted 4,200 trees in less than a day, and cleared off. And
that's a really interesting one, David, actually, because there will be, again, I was thinking of the smaller sites as we spoke about them, but of course there are areas in the large site that our machinery can't access.
Yes, that's exactly. And what he was saying was that the combine harvesters, particularly the bigger ones, can't get into the corners. So you're left with these corners which tend to get a bit waterlogged. And so by planting mini forests in them, first of all, it dries out the land. Secondly, it gives you a beautiful area of biodiversity. Third, it gives you windbreaks for your cereal land and everything. And the problem with this erosion from the wind of all the good land is helped. So there are a whole series of benefits. Fourthly, again, that really important point I think about forest fires is that it's going to become an increasingly problematical thing around the world. And if we are clever and streetwise and plant these hundreds of thousands of areas of native biodiversity, I think it's almost like a win-win situation. It's very hard to find a fault in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Through our work, we travel across the country, and I'm willing to say it here and now, Richard and David, count me as one of your supporters, because as we're traveling the country, we see space that could be used, but I'm really curious to see how this might work in a placemaking and place shaping where we're actually either trying to regenerate, particularly at the moment with our town centre first programme, and we're trying to make town centres more attractive. We're trying to encourage new retailers. And actually, particularly in a lot of our large market towns, there would be spaces where you could do this. So I think I think it's a really interesting proposition. I know after our conversation today, I definitely will be looking when I'm traveling around, whether it's in an urban or rural setting, I will definitely be looking at space differently, knowing that there is the potential for 2,500 native trees on a quarter of an acre. It's definitely given me a fresh perspective, and I hope it will do the same for others. And I'm definitely willing to spread this message among the design teams, creating places, because I think it is more in tune with what the next generation, what they want to see. They don't want to see sterile lawns. They want that bird song you've described. They want access to native trees. They want that colour. So I think it's very compelling. So I suppose before we finish up today, and I am conscious of your time, and I'm very conscious that you both have, 100,000 trees in the ground is huge. There's 100 million that you want to get to. So I'm conscious I can't delay you anymore, because you both have a lot of work to do. But what can the construction industry and the real estate, and for those who have a genuine interest in practical, helping you practically on the ground, how can they help you? What are their next steps?
Well, our target for next year is 1 million trees, Carol, and we would like ideally one organisation to back that project for next year first. We need 1.3 million euro to do that. And if we were to get that, to be able to say to a company, we will guarantee, David and myself, my sister Tina, there's a family thing here, we're organising it all. You have our expertise making this happen. We will guarantee to plant 1 million trees for you. That will, in itself, will sequester 14,000 tons of carbon, planting 1 million trees per annum after year 5. So there's a huge benefit. I mean, for example, if we were to convince the Irish government to use the Miyawaki approach, all we would need is 500,000 acres of land in Ireland. Now, you've travelled the roads, you see all the empty fields. 500,000 acres would completely neutralise our carbon emissions for the whole of Ireland. That's 5 billion trees, 5 billion native trees planted in the Miyawaki. It's tiny. And yet Ireland could be the first person to actually say we've neutralised our carbon emissions. So we would have thought that it's a very strong message for one of your larger construction companies to say, we'll back this next year, and we can say we will have planted 1 million trees in 1 year.
You make a very compelling case, and I do think it's not just aligning with the agendas that leading home builders have. They're not doing this in a tokenistic way. They absolutely want to make a difference. They want to have impact, and I think you're giving people a route to impact. So I'm thank you so much. I genuinely appreciate you both joining me today from opposite sides of the country. And I myself am in Connemara, despite the background. So between us, even today, as we travelled the roads, I think we could probably find the amount of land that you need to be able to hit that target. But I hope that the industry gets behind you. You make a very compelling case for it, and I'm genuinely delighted to have spoken to you both today, and I appreciate it. That was Richard and David Mulcahy, co-founders of the 100 Million Trees Project. And my thanks, as always, to producer Katie Tallon and to the audio team at Hear Me Roar Media. Before we go, just a special word of thanks to our sponsor, Proptech Ireland, for supporting the podcast and for making these conversations possible. And finally, thank you indeed for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Proptech Hot Seat. Next time, we probably will be talking about technology. And in the meantime, please be sure to check out all of the other Irish and international real estate and construction shows here on iPropertyRadio.com.